everything that we have, kind of built our platform on since way back at the beginning of REDF. So I just think that was an incredible accomplishment and really visionary, and I've always just admired that. And the longer I'm in this business, the more I admire that we kind of came up with that and had the drive and the ability to kind of build it, build the base of this. And then the other thing, and I know we've talked about this over the years, Jed went on to obviously do some other stuff and a lot of other ideas, but he really originated this idea, for those of you who don't know, of blended value. And he really was thinking early on about, I think, all the trends that we've now seen that have led to impact investing and what we call shared value, and really sort of the way capital is starting to change, both on the private sector side and the philanthropic side. And if you read, I don't know if you guys have ever looked at it, it's still up, you can still get it, but the early stuff on blended value, he really basically nailed it all then. And to some extent, it's frustrating because you read new things and they have new labels and new headlines, and you're like, but this is what he was talking about, 20 years ago. And I think that often happens, it's like there are certain visionary, brilliant people at the beginning have an insight, and then later there's a lot of repackaging, and sometimes without reference back to the original insight. So at least, here I want to acknowledge that and just thank you for that, because I think it's had really profound implications for changing the social sector in ways that are really important and really meaningful for marginalized people who don't often get benefit from the the fruits of that kind of thing. Anyway, thank you for that. So maybe just so Jed knows who's in the room, who's on staff at REDF? Raise your hands. Okay, great. Farbers, welcome.
Yes, baby.
Anybody else?
Is that LA?
Mm-hmm.
We're definitely getting some.
Someone's
LA is
listening.
on the line.
Oh yeah. How many people are in LA on the line?
Vivian?
Hello, LA.
Yeah, Carrie's on the line.
Carrie's on the line. Okay. Anybody else
On the line.
Okay. All right. So there's a few people
Someplace else.
in LA. Can you mute? Excuse me. Are you guys muted, or can you mute?
Well, or just be aware that we're hearing everything that you say.
Yeah.
Just know.
So you know.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So anyhow, thank you so much for coming today. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm going to ask a few questions, and Jed will share a few things, and then we'll open it up. I want to have time for your questions too. So, I just wanted to start kind of with the early days, because I think it would be fun and interesting for people here who don't know kind of how this all got going. And maybe you can just reflect on anything you want to say about sort of what this was in the early days, how it felt, what I know just a few people sitting at the Presidio, a few dogs, but maybe just kind of any maybe wins or inspirations or things in those early days that led you to think, gee, we're on to something here, and then wanting to kind of take it to a different level.
Sure. Well, there were a number of kind of elements that I think came together in the late 80s and early 90s that kind of laid the foundation, not only for REDF, but for a lot of the current conversation that we're all a part of today. And I think that part of that was maybe a generation of social workers and people doing community work who became increasingly frustrated with the traditional way to think about nonprofit management and philanthropy and the role of the nonprofit sector. And in my case, I was founding director of the Larkin Street Youth Center, and I'm really proud of a lot of things that we did there around, very aggressive street outreach around AIDS intervention, homeless youth, and a whole host of things. But I really reached a point after about 3 or 4 years where I felt like there was a complete disconnect between the work that we were doing on the street and the way that money moved in support of our work. My father and grandfather were Presbyterian ministers, and I can stand up and I can make you cry about homeless youth, and you will give me money. And that has nothing to do with the quality of the work that we were doing. So at Larkin Street, we would get kids from other programs who would come up to us for services, but the money would not follow. And San Francisco, is a very kind of political place in terms of social service politics. And I just became really kind of disenchanted with the way that system worked. And so realized that I wanted to do something different personally, and that I didn't want to spend 30 years kind of running a nonprofit, going out and having to raise funds on terms that were never really connected to performance. The way I thought of it was that money moves on the basis of politics, perception, and persuasion, and not performance. And what I wanted to do was something different, and I had no idea what that meant, really. And then I think you have a generation of business people, represented by George, who had made their wealth in business, obviously, and in free enterprise in the market system, and yet were being asked to give their money away on terms and bases that were in some sense antithetical to how they actually had created that wealth. And so when you think about, and this is more true 20, 30 years ago than it is today, which makes me feel really old, but in any event, but when you think about how most people have traditionally thought about funding for nonprofits, you don't think about matching the type of money to the stage of development of the nonprofit organization. You don't think about connecting, the performance of the nonprofit with how funds are moved into and deployed through the nonprofit. There's not that connection really between, demonstrated value creation and getting more capital. And in some cases, the business model for the nonprofit sector is one that expects you to, in essence, cash out at the end of every year and start over again, as opposed to building kind of long-term kind of endowments or financial capacity to execute a business strategy. Or it's a model that says that, you go out and you raise $25,000 for a $250,000 strategy, and the foundation that gives you the 25 grand is really like, we really believe in you and everything, right? And you're supposed to go out and raise the balance of what you need to actually execute the business plan. At that time, multi-year grants was more of a rare thing. General operating support was more of a rare thing. There were just a host of ways that we did business in the, let's say, 70s and 80s, that I think in the 90s, a lot of folks who created new wealth began really questioning. And I think that when you had the new money that came in, certainly into the Bay Area and then other places as well, Seattle, with a lot of the innovations in finance and technology, these are folks who made their money through venture capital strategies, through startups, through disruptive kind of mindsets around, what could be. And so I think George in 89 asked me with Lyman Casey to basically begin researching, like, how could we create and execute an approach to philanthropy that would be informed by and would operate, on the premise of kind of taking business acumen and approaches and using that to drive community change, instead of taking a traditional kind of charitable kind of approach. And so, the first thing that I did was spend about 4 to 6 months just simply researching this idea of kind of like, how do you bring business into a community and social application, and what does it mean to do that? Because obviously, this was not a new idea. It was actually an old idea that in the 70s and 80s had been set aside, I think. And so that's what we first did, was in essence spent time. I interviewed maybe 200 folks across the country at leading foundations, at community development groups in the nonprofit sector. And I said, we're interested in kind of free enterprise strategies related to economic development for formerly homeless people. And inevitably, the response that I got was, "This is a horrible idea. Like, don't go anywhere near that." In fact, one program officer from a leading national foundation that will remain nameless actually said, "If there's one thing we know, it's that nonprofits can't run businesses. And if you have new money, put it into job training. Don't put it into any kind of an enterprise kind of strategy, because we already know that doesn't work." And so great. So I'm getting that kind of feedback at this level. But then at the same time, I had come out of the homeless community, this homeless service provider community in the Bay Area, and I would go out and start meeting with folks. I was primarily in the homeless youth area as opposed to the adult or the broader kind of space. And as I would go out and talk with folks, it was really fascinating, because you would find these smaller nonprofit organizations that said, "Look, we can't get our people into job training programs because they're viewed as having too many barriers to employment." And at that time, it was all JTPA, Job Training Partnership Act funding, which meant 30-day classroom-based training programs at the end of which you were expected to get a job. And so you go through the classroom scenario, and then you'd be placed, so to speak. And the challenge for formerly homeless folks is that they truly had too many barriers to be successful in that type of strategy. And so the people running those programs didn't want them, because they would make the program look bad, because they would wash out, or they would not be successful at placement. And the folks who needed that opportunity basically didn't want to go into that, because they knew that they were going to fail one more time. And so you would talk with some of these nonprofits, and they'd say, "Well, look, we can't get our folks into the training programs. All of our people had already been fired by all the for-profits. And so we decided we're going to start a cafe or a screen printing shop or a landscaping business or a bakery. And that way, if somebody begins to fail, we can intervene right there. And instead of their going back one step, or going back like 5 steps, they go back 1 step, and we can use our profits." This was the theory. Use our profits to expand, supported employment for these folks, right? And to have allowance for increased wastage, because people didn't really know what they were doing. So you have to train them up, that kind of thing. And it was really interesting, because basically I went back to George and Leanne in late '89. And I said, "Look, here's the deal. Everybody thinks this is a really bad idea. So you just need to know that right up front. And if you're going to do this, you have to understand you have to be in this for at least 3 to 5 years. You can't really do this for a year as an initiative and think you're going to have anything to show for it. And you have to be willing to spend up some money, because this isn't like a $100,000 grant initiative. This is like $1 to $2 million a year kind of thing. And you have to be ready that we could do all this stuff and it could still fail, because you're talking about market-based businesses. And if it's a recycling enterprise and all of a sudden, I don't know what, the Europeans dump a bunch of aluminum on the market, the whole thing could go out of business, right? Not as any result of any failure on your part, but just the market is a tough place to operate. And so I said to him, you need to. The only way you could do it is on these terms and conditions. And in my mind, I actually started circulating my resume, because I was kind of like, what foundation person would want to take this on, right? Because I was kind of saying, this is basically, you're talking about taking everybody that all of your competitors have already fired and starting a company. Right? But it was really funny, because I didn't understand at that time the mindset of people like George. And to his mind, it was like, well, a multi-year strategy, of course you would want to think about that. You wouldn't want to just do something as a one-off. And, the fact that you've got to put money in to make money work, that makes sense. Yeah, I can get my head around that. And the fact that this is high risk, he was like a leveraged buyout guy. And it's not like you're gambling. It's like you're taking an informed risk, right? And there's a real difference, I think. And when I was a social worker, I used to think of it all as just kind of like gambling and speculation. And the more I learned about the way people think about it, it's like, you do your homework. And if you understand the odds, then you can take an informed risk. And I think that's what he and Leanne wanted to do. And so they basically called me back, and we were talking about all the different issues and factors and everything. And I finally, in the meeting, I just, I turned to them and said, kind of like, so do you want to do this, or you not want to do this, or what's it? And Leanne she was great, because she looked at me and she said, well, we want to do it, but can we do it for just $1 million a year? And I was like, I think I could do some damage. Because I actually pitched a higher number. But anyway, so that's kind of some of what went into that first kind of iteration of what then became REDF.
Yeah, and I think, in a way, sort of with the risk, it's like the fact that it was a hard thing to do and nobody had done it, I think also really intrigued him,
Right.
From the perspective of innovation.
Well, and I
Doing
also
something
think
different.
there was, again, this new kind of mindset of what now people call social entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
These folks who, to my mind, were people who saw value in opportunities that other folks didn't see value. And so when you look at most formerly homeless folks, you don't really start out and go like, okay, like this is somebody I want to invest in, right? And yet these folks were seeing people and saying, if we could do this, if we could structure it this way, if we could have this support, we could actually make something happen here for that individual, for their family, but also for our community and for us as an organization who's trying to provide some real kind of opportunities and exits for folks from these kind of perpetual systems of relief and charitable giving.
So maybe I'm just going to ask one other question, and then hopefully you guys are going to have a lot of questions. It's been 20, how many years is it? 89, more than 20 years, 25 years or so. And the field has evolved a lot. And it's interesting because you were grounded here both in you were first rooted in, look, these people are not getting the service that they need. Then these organizations are not structured properly. The revenue is not structured. Capital is not structured properly. And then I feel like your thinking really evolved, and obviously you went off into a whole stream of work that has led to tremendous change in the country around the way capital is deployed to address, these larger problems and to create value. And so maybe if you can just wrap into sort of some of your thinking around kind of the evolution of things over the last 20 years. Things have changed and evolved a lot since that early insight, and since you first started doing the work, both in your own work and your REDF. We've tried to develop and enhance and build on that model. And I guess I'd be interested in just your reflections. Want to bring in the political environment, great. But, sort of what you've seen, what has changed, maybe things that have surprised you in your own thinking, over the last 20 years or so around those broader issues about capitalizing this kind of work. And if you want to reflect at all on REDF.
You may have to break that
down. Yeah. I was just trying to, got it, yeah. At least around your own thinking around what's happened with investing.
I think what happened for me was that basically we were taking philanthropic capital and placing it in market-facing firms that were owned by nonprofit organizations in order to employ formerly homeless people. And so right in the middle, it was kind of like, is it a nonprofit? Is it a for-profit? How do you think about this? And I think that for me, what clearly happened was by the end of the 90s, I'd become, so that's part of the issue. Then what happened is when I went to George in maybe 95, 96, and I said, you can see this is, there's potential here. This is really working. We should go launch like a REDF LA or a REDF New York, or we should like roll this stuff out like, across the country. And very nicely, George said, well, I really don't want to do that. I like, having the focus here. And this is again, 20 years ago. I like having the focus here, and I like knowing the names of the managers, and we would take them out to see the companies and stuff. And it was really fun. It was really good. And he said, so instead of, launching little mini REDFs, I'll just kind of launch you out to go talk about all this stuff with other people. So early on with REDF, we started doing a lot of focus on kind of knowledge development and dissemination as a part of what we were doing. And so we published our first 400-page report, which was like a book on new social entrepreneurs in '96, and then we had the box set in 2000, and we just continually were feeding our experience into the broader conversation. And part of that was the social return on investment framework that we developed, again, in part out of a conversation between George and myself and our team around how well, we know how to track financial performance and return. How do you understand a time zero valuation of social equity, and then the return that you can project over time based on your investment at time zero? How do you think about this stuff? So we developed this, and I started taking this on the road and talking a lot about SROI and all that. And I would meet foundation people, and I would also meet for-profit social investors who would say, and both of these folks were, at the time, all this fuzzy language was great fun, and people would say, well, we invest for social returns, right? And I'd say, great, here's our framework for social return analysis. How do you measure the social return? And they would just kind of look at you and they'd laugh and they'd say, oh no, it's a metaphor. You don't actually do that, but that's kind of what we think we're doing, right? And so in the late 90s, I started getting more and more invitations to speak with mission-driven, for-profit social investors doing either private equity or venture, who were saying how can we think about this differently? And then by 2000, I realized that I had just morphed into this place where I'd become totally agnostic about the organizational form or the investment vehicle. So I realized that I'd stopped thinking about for-profit versus nonprofit or cooperative, and they were all just organizations. And I'd stopped thinking about philanthropic, near market, and market rate, and it was all just different ways to structure capital. So the issue for me became, what's fundamentally the nature of the value that you're trying to create? And what are the sets of organizational form and the types of capital structure that can be leveraged in order to help you as a entrepreneur, as an investor, as a whomever, achieve what it is you're trying to create in the world? And I think that I was just a part of this whole shift in thinking we've seen over the last certainly 15 years now, where people are really kind of moving out of a bifurcated frame that says that nonprofits are the ones who do good, and businesses are mercenary capitalists who are destroying the planet, and kind of saying, well, actually, they're all just different types of organizations. And the question is, how do you drive kind of, in my language, blended value through these various organizational forms in order to optimize total performance, which would include social, environmental, and social impacts that you want to create through the application of capital and the management of organizations. And so I think that frame, you look at Social Venture Network, you look at Investor Circle, you look at Business for Social Responsibility. All of that was coming up at the same time. And I was moving in and out of those networks at the same time that I was in the social entrepreneur and the venture philanthropy space. And I think it's all just one kind of conversation today in a way that it just wasn't 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, are there other, so looking at that, and you've done a lot of, obviously, advising of individuals, who are trying to move into this area, as well as foundations like Ed McConnell Clark. You help them set out their strategy that's led to their big fund, national fund. I guess just maybe a couple of, markers or surprises, both positive and negative, along the way. It's kind of what's been pleasantly surprising, wow, it really began to move this way. On the other hand, maybe what's been stuck, or, where it would seem gee, I thought it was going to evolve, and it just hasn't.
Right. So I think the surprise is how fast the conversation has shifted in the last 5 years. I think that the way I think of it is that it's kind of like you have all these block parties, right? You had all these actors who knew each other and were hanging out together and partying. So you had the nonprofit social entrepreneurs, you had the for-profit social venture people, you had the SRI kind of institutional screen investment strategy people. You had all these different sets of actors on their own block. And what's happened in the last 5 years is all these people, it's just kind of exploded on their block, and they're pouring onto the avenue, and you look up and down the avenue and there's a fucking parade, right? It's oh my God, where did all these people come from? It's just crazy. And And you begin to kind of see, well, this is my marching band, but it's actually connected with this other marching band. And you're all holding these banners, and they're all kind of generally the same theme with reference to your own kind of interest area, right? But it's all the same conversation. And I think, that clearly is what's happened in my mind, at least in the capital side, where you've got a host of folks who basically are very traditional kind of for-profit investors who are saying, we're looking at climate change, they're looking at drought, they're looking at pandemics, and they're saying these things represent kind of risk to my portfolio. So how do I protect myself as an investor? And then those same people started thinking, well, if I could sell water in a different way, or if I could do solar, they started flipping from the risk to the opportunity conversation. And so that unleashed a whole bunch of stuff. And you have then the pension funds and other folks who are more institutional investors who basically have led a lot of the climate change kind of conversations and initiatives. Those folks are all of a sudden kind of connecting with the private capital individuals who are doing more venture and private equity and angel and creating these kind of investing in the new solution set, if you will. And then the reason that I've worked with families so much over the last 7 to 8 years is that at the family level, people don't think in terms of themselves as a bucket, right? They're a family and they have these different vehicles. And they're like, well, we have our, here's our market rate sustainable capital, and here's our philanthropy, and here's our, early stage venture. And they're kind of like, these are all different vehicles that they feel they can express their goals through. And it's a total portfolio approach. Whereas if you're in a foundation, this is what I do, this is who I am, yeah. Right. Or if I'm an institutional investor, this is, these are the returns I have to get. But families kind of connect the dots across the capital spectrum in a very natural way. And so I think a lot of the family office work has really laid the foundation for some of the other capital folks to come in and say, okay, you can actually do this. You can invest across a portfolio from philanthropic to near market to market rate. And it's not a question of like sacrifice. It's not like how much are you going to give up in order to do good. It's a question of simply understanding that impact looks differently across asset classes. And below market is not below market. It's simply what this instrument offers across that continuum.
Yeah.
And so I think all of that has just like blammo.
Yeah. So that's so
to use an investment term.
Blammo good. And what about like where you're like, I thought it was going to go farther, but it's stymied, or where are the things that you haven't seen that you thought you might?
So on the one hand, again, it's great that we have all these folks kind of coming together in the avenue, doing the big parade. I don't understand people who still don't fundamentally get it, right? They don't see what this opportunity really is, who still come in and they just haven't had either enough time or experience to kind of morph into this other place. And so they're still asking questions around, gosh, can I do well? Can I do good? They still get like stuck on the reality that some of the metrics and measurement pieces are hard to do. And I'm kind of like, well, we've had like 400 years to develop econometrics. I'm thinking we could take another 20 to like social and environmental performance. I mean, it's not like, and so I think some folks, they still don't quite understand like what this fundamentally is as an opportunity and as a mindset and as a way to be in the world, if you will. And I get that. I mean, people, you have your identity, you have your silo, and you have who you are. And I've just kind of, as you know, accidentally led this life where I've kind of dumbfucked my way through various things because they fall apart, right? If you really believe something and you're really passionate and you drive it into the ground, you blow out the other side and you're like, well, I need this other frame, right? And I think I've been really lucky because I've kind of been able to do that. And I think it's much harder to do that today, actually. You know what I mean? Because people, they look at you, they look at the resume and they're kind of like, well, I want somebody who's got, market rate investing experience and has run a community development fund and is, they have all these criteria now, right? I couldn't get any of the positions that I had 20 years ago today because I just can't compete against somebody. Thank God for that.
So maybe, last, no, I just want to open it up. Let me do that first. Anybody questions here? Yes, Dave.
So I'm curious what you see. You've talked a lot about investors and capital and participants, but what about on the business supply side, like creating opportunities for these individuals on the street? What do you see? Are you seeing success? Are you seeing, is entrepreneurship happening and benefiting or have the potential to benefit? I mean, I'd be curious of your read on that.
Well, I mean, we're certainly seeing the creation of a lot of accelerators and incubators and a lot more activity on the kind of venture startup side of the conversation. I don't know that we know right now what the long-term success of all that is going to be. I think we've got more and more innovation on the startup and kind of entrepreneurship side. And I also think more and more existing firms are reflecting on and exploring kind of like how they can also integrate some of these ideas into their current practices. So I think that in another 5 to 10 years, we really will see a shift in terms of how businesses think about, sourcing employees, for example. There's a firm in Denver, for example, that's a straight up for-profit, light manufacturing company that has a phenomenal job training program as a part of what they do to kind of build the personnel that they need to do their work, because they were finding that people were coming to them who, on the one hand, were great candidates, but on the other hand, didn't have the skill set that they really needed to go right onto the floor and contribute. And so by virtue of their commitment to being a profitable firm, they've created a very impressive kind of on-the-ground training program for folks that, to my mind, kind of beats any number of nonprofit job training programs because it's directly connected to job creation and placement. So I think we'll see more and more of that kind of thing where traditional for-profit business people will start saying, I could actually benefit as a company by taking some of these ideas in-house. And then I do think that more and more of the kind of mission-driven for-profit entrepreneurs are focused on the startup side as well, of course, and we're going to just continue to have to see how many of those are ultimately sustainable over time. And as they move into a bifurcated market, right, that doesn't necessarily value the social and environmental piece, can they manage the challenge of operating on an integrated basis in a bifurcated world, in a bifurcated market? And we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Would you say, on that, thinking about sort of equity, inequity, poverty issues, workforce, things like that, and on the other hand, environment, all the things related to environment, do you feel like kind of one is outpacing the other on the creation of these sorts of enterprises that actually address both, or do you see it kind of evolving, in both these areas in parallel?
So here's the trick. I don't know how you think about equity and justice and not think about environmental issues. And because when you think about the majority of people who are going to be displaced by climate change are not the middle class and the wealthy, it's the low income folks in Bangladesh. It's, and so I think that they're just inherently, again, kind of blended. Mm-hmm. And I think what we do ourselves a disservice by playing so much to the different silo piece and not playing across, because I think it's a much more powerful scenario to think in terms of, racial justice issues and connecting communities as opposed to playing to each community kind of thing. I know one guy who's running a private equity fund that's an impact fund, and part of his strategy is to take his investor group into the different communities that they're investing in and actually facilitating a whole process of community conversations so that the investors can have a different understanding of what it is the companies are actually doing on the ground in these communities. And so community residents can have their own voice to capital, if you will, and not be intermediated by his firm, if you will. And he views that, I don't know what he calls it, but to my mind, it's kind of like community connectivity initiative as part and parcel of his investment thesis. Right? That's real. I think that's a really nice kind of integrated way to think about it. And I think that the trick is when you see a lot of folks coming out of traditional finance, they're not there yet. They don't really get that. They're still thinking of this as kind of like, well, I can do well and do good, and this kind of thing. But it's a very light kind of, it's a broad market impact. It's not a deep community impact. And I think that great. I mean, we need to have all these different kind of options and alternatives. And over time, I think more and more folks who are wanting to be intentional about impact will gravitate toward those strategies that are deeper and more sustained and more profound, if you will, as opposed to, gosh, can I just screen out the bad stuff and can I invest in some solar and feel good. You know what I mean? Like, I think folks will over time, especially as you look at the shift in fiduciary ownership and, you know, the rising number of current millennials who become 30, 40 somethings who are trustees, and the shift of asset ownership from men to women as the men die, as the women kind of take over the capital. I mean, it's like, this is all good stuff. It's going to shift people's understandings of what it means to be a good fiduciary.
Other questions? Yes.
All right, so you've talked about doing well and doing good a couple times. And I think sometimes as REDF, we actually have to kind of, it creates this unintentional consequence that puts us at a disadvantage, because on the good side, yes, there's so many people who are thinking about I need to do well, but can I also do good? But then we have companies, but doing well sort of implies at a base level that you're getting your money back. It's not, we generally don't think about that as philanthropic. The philanthropic piece of it is maybe sacrificing piece of the return, but there's generally still a return of the capital. And then here we are with these phenomenal businesses where, yeah, sometimes there might be an opportunity for an equity investment or an equity-like investment or debt, but many times the most the most appropriate capital is philanthropic. And we have this whole field now of investors from foundations and families, et cetera, who look at our businesses and say, yes, that's exactly, like, that has the social return that I want. And then we struggle with saying, it does, but it's not going to be the financial return that you want. So what is your advice for how we stay competitive in this field where we're trying to kind of work within that field of do well and do good, but we want the capital to be philanthropic?
Right. Well, again, I think the language of do well and do good is like a legacy frame from the bifurcated either or kind of perspective. And so I think of it as performance, and I think of it as needing to educate people about total performance. And if folks are, and again, this is why I like working with families, because you can be more holistic in terms of how you understand the capital they have to deploy and what kind of returns different pieces of that capital have to generate in order for the family to achieve the overall goal that they're trying to get to. And so I think part of the trick in terms of the REDF conversation with these types of investors is first having a conversation around placing them on that capital continuum and having them understand where they are on that capital continuum and what is the purpose of their wealth. How do they understand the return requirements of this money and what does it look like? I mean, to my mind, if you're interested in economic development for formerly homeless folks or people who are trying to move back into employability, the option used to be you would make either a charitable gift or use public funding to fund a job training program, and that would be it. And you wouldn't get any of your money back, right? And you would just like do the service and hope to God that somebody got a job at the back end. And what this is saying is, well, instead of that, basically we can cover 80% of the operating expenses by virtue of earned income or other activities of the enterprise piece, but 20% still needs to be subsidized in order to do the kind of supported employment element, these other kind of programmatic offerings. And so therefore, no, it's not going to fit in the full market return kind of bucket, but it doesn't fit in the philanthropic bucket. It's here, it's in this kind of concessionary part of the portfolio. And part of the trick is, I think, we have to think that way as we're having these conversations with folks, and we have to teach asset owners and investors and philanthropists how to think that way as well. So they're coming to this conversation with the right understanding. And I think part of the frustration that a lot of people have, whether it's entrepreneurs or investors, asset owners, in this discussion is this kind of like, right deals with wrong capital kind of thing. I see a lot of people who get really frustrated because they're like, well, we went in, we had this great meeting, we were connecting and all that, and then they said they needed to get like a 10% return financially, right? And it's like, and you're talking to the wrong part of the portfolio, right? Whereas if you start out, if the asset owner is clear, like here's the kind of capital we have, here's what we're trying to deploy for, here's our understanding of performance, then the entrepreneurs can say, this fits, this doesn't fit, and why. And then from a field building perspective, you can say here are the categories of capital that still need to be cultivated and developed. And to this issue of kind of like philanthropy and the role of philanthropy in the conversation, I think it was Acumen did a piece a number of years ago around the, what did they call it, this pioneer gap.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's kind of funny, like I always, I mean, I have to smile, and at the same time, it's super frustrating because you talk to venture capitalists, right? And they'll be like, well, you know, we only fund, you know, 1 in 100. And then of those, you know, only, you know, 6 are like walking wounded, and 1 is a home run, and the rest are just like dogs that we have to go out and kill. And you're kind of like, okay, this sounds a lot like philanthropy. You have one really great poverty program, you have some that are kind of like not so great, and some just should be like out and crucified. You know what I mean? But somehow we have this idea that like venture capital is not a form of philanthropy. And I don't get it. Like, you know, there's, you know, these guys walk around here and they have these like badges of honor because the number of failures they've had. Oh, I've learned so much and I'm failing forward. I'm like, you know. So anyway, so I think we need to rethink, you know, the whole conversation. And it's hard because you get folks that come in, they haven't spent a lot of their life thinking about this stuff. And so part of the challenge is really educating the market around what this conversation is, what the possibilities are, and how those individuals fit in the different parts of the strategy that's being advanced.
So I'm curious, in the years that you've now been doing this, I mean, the SROI also has a tremendous value when you're talking in the public sector and around policy. And there's now social impact bonds, there's now pay for success. I'm curious to what your thoughts are around what's the role of the public sector in this arena. Is it not stay out and let us do the market? Where do you see the sweet spot or the opportunities over, you know, kind of with your experience?
Well, I mean, so because of my experiences in my 20s, I wanted to have nothing to do with public policy or government through most of my 30s and 40s. And now that I'm in my late 50s, I'm kind of much more open to the idea. Well, actually, yes, there's a very credible place for the public sector, of course. So, and part of it comes out when we developed the SROI framework. One of the things we did in terms of outreach was we went to a nameless local government entity. And we said, like, look at this, like we created this really elegant kind of way that you can track social performance and impact, and you could basically match like your capital distributions based on impact. You could move back toward performance-based contracting, which we had in the 70s and 80s, but we eliminated. And you could do all this stuff. And they said, you know, this is so great. We really love this. Thank you so much for coming in. This is not how money moves, right? In the public sector, we have interest groups and we have special interest communities, and we have to make sure that X amount of our budget goes to this community and that community and that community. It's really not based on actually changing anything. It's based on deploying kind of like public dollars and funds. And so I think, you know, that's an issue. That's a problem. And it's a reality. So you got to figure out kind of like, how does that work? The other part to that is if you look at some of the CIVs that have been kind of rolled out, they're sold on the basis that this is high risk experimentation, and so we're going to do a risk sharing between private, you know, money and public money, and if private money takes that early risk and it's proven that this strategy is successful, then we can use public money to kind of pay off, you know, that return, if you will, or take those cost savings and split them between the public and the private pot. But in fact, what I think is happening is you're seeing some folks in the political side using CIVs as cover for not having the political conversations that they actually really need to have around how to fund stuff, right? And a lot of the early CIVs are for things that, to my mind, there's no risk. I mean, like, does anybody really not believe that you save public money by putting more money into early childhood and after school activities? I don't know. I think we have a pretty good evidence base for that. Right? Does anybody believe that, you know, by having certain programs that do follow up with folks coming out of prisons and jails, that you can't decrease recidivism? I don't know. I think there's a pretty good evidence base for that, right? So I think that some of the CIV stuff, you know, I think great. And if this is how people have to get there, maybe that's just the reality. But at the same time, I'm like, we shouldn't use it to avoid having like the political discussions and challenged kind of conversations that we need to have. We should use it as a way to get away from that reality and kind of beg off. And that's my concern with some of the civ stuff. So I think it's kind of it's a low grade way to avoid confrontation around public funding and the prioritization of public funding. How's that? That's not a very affirming civ, but there you go.
Well,
I'm a
I mean,
bitter old man.
Yeah, I mean, I think the positive side of it would be a different interpretation.
That would be
Pollyanna here would be, you know, I think, and I was trying to think of the analogy on the private sector side, but you could say it actually is finally opening up a path to have that public sector conversation, because it is a very hard conversation to have, and it's very hard for bureaucrats to get that conversation going in the absence of political support from the elected officials who are pressured by these constituencies. And so if you can't have the conversation to begin with, kind of how do you get there? Well, this shiny new thing that takes the risk off of us and puts it over here also can allow then for a discussion about, gee, it worked, so shouldn't we be thinking about that as we allocate public dollars?
Right.
So I mean, that would be
fair.
the,
And I think that's,
you know,
and
positive
that
side.
will be what I think happens over time. And I'm, you know, and then I guess the other question I have is with at least the structures that I've seen, they all have this very large intermediation function. So there's an entity that has to be created or come in that basically manages the process and does the evidence-based
Right.
analysis and all that kind of thing. And I'm kind of like, well, if we all just operated with better metrics to begin with, you could almost eliminate that, and you could go straight to performance-based contracting.
Right.
So I think
Yeah, that's
there's an excess cost that we're
No, that's
carrying in
right.
these vehicles that I'm just kind of like frustrated by.
True.
As much as I love all those people who
Yeah.
are in those intermediaries.
Yeah. Very true. Jason.
I had a question. This is going to go, like, I guess maybe really high up here and maybe a little bit dark, but kind of to your question or what you were saying about, I feel a lot of sort of the way that impact investing and everything is set up is to sort of make an economic argument for investing in social solutions and things like that. But when I feel like in the last 6 to 8 months or whatever, we've seen a lot, and you kind of say that there's a lot of evidence around XYZ intervention being really positive. I feel like in some cases, sometimes in our current society, people question that evidence or don't care about it, or that's not what people are making decisions on. And so I don't know if, like, what do you think about sort of the value of an economic argument for investing in certain solutions in a era when people are more about special interests and more about, like, fake news, exactly, discrediting science.
Well, I mean, we're all certainly very excited about the new administration, and the policies and insights that everybody's for. You know, yeah, that's just so we're clear. You know, I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't know that was ever not the case. That folks, on the one hand, talk a lot about metrics and rational kind of decision making, and then go a completely different direction. I think when I was a young man, you would hear these business people talk about, well, the nonprofit sector has to become more business-like and rational, and use that economic analysis. And then, I sit on various investment committees, and I have observed this across the board. And boy, howdy, certainly the economic and the rational analysis is there, but a lot of times it's kind of like, I really like Bob Schmempke. I'd love to be in that deal. That's not like rational business. And so I think that the first thing is I would just kind of question how rational we've ever been. I think, a lot of life and reality stuff is this combination, kind of some level of analysis and some level of emotion. And the whole myth of the rational markets, all of this stuff, I think we just need to remember. And I think today we're operating in this environment of denial on any number of fronts, whether it's social or environmental or economic denial. And so I think we need to be careful about that. And, I've never let reality stop me from doing what I want to do in the world. And so if that's the reality, that's fine. But it's not, it's a different reality from what it was 20 years ago. But boy, I remember back when the whole metrics conversation first came into the nonprofit sector for the probably 70th time in the early 90s, where people were like, oh, like if you get too oriented toward metrics, you're going to tear the heart and soul out of the nonprofit sector. And I mean, a lot of my former colleagues in the nonprofit community hate the stuff that I've been promoting for a long time because they feel that it tears the heart out of, being a philanthropist or something, right? And I guess it depends on who are you accountable to? Are you accountable to foundations and asset owners? Or are you accountable to community actors and agents and activists and residents who are trying to do something meaningful? And I think that, I've been really lucky because I've been in these different places where I've been able to kind of shake up the thinking of folks who really do have the power to move money in a different way and to think about things differently. And at the end of the day, I hold myself responsible for trying to advance some of that. And then you got to trust that other people will step up and then execute in other ways that will have deep and sustained impact in a meaningful way at the street and community level in a way that I can't really. And that's just the nature of the way life goes as well. So anyway, I don't know if that was a good response, but it's the one I have to offer you.
Hey, anybody on the phone want to throw in a question? Because we're getting toward the end. Anybody in LA?
They've all nodded off.
Yeah.
They might not be on mute.
Okay.
Oh, they're on mute.
Yeah, they're on mute. Yeah.
I have.
I'm sorry. What? Oh, okay. Arthur, go ahead. And I think this would be.
So I'm kind of a technological alarmist, and I'm really scared about technology and automation taking frontline jobs. And a lot of the people that we invest in are on the frontline staff. I'm just wondering, what you would think about that for our future, for anything like that. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, like what kind of opportunities will play out. But I'm just, I'm really wondering if essentially so many of these jobs are going to be automated. Future, trucking, all these different things. Where does it leave, our beneficiaries? So
I think it's a huge challenge. I think it's a really, and again, I think it calls into question the fact that we're not having more profound discussions around politics and society and economics, and that it all gets kind of boiled down to these positions that you then have to defend. The automation of driving, the automation of light manufacturing. All these things we've already seen. This is in fact why the new administration is there, because the damage that's been done to the working community around these issues. That said, I think the policy implications are huge, and we need to re-engage on that level, whether it's universal basic income or other ideas that are out there that we can begin to explore. I do think it goes back to questions around kind of social responsibility, the nature of community, how we understand connectivity with each other. And my concern with technology certainly are all the things that you just raised, but also is that it allows us to play to our lowest common denominator, which is the individual. And to think that individuals operate in the absence of social connections, whether it's, kids at dinner tables who just are staring at the screen, or even just walking on the street where you're like waiting, and normally like 15 years ago you'd strike up a conversation with the person next to you. Today you just don't. It's like everybody's focused on their little tablet, and so I think there's some very profound kind of issues that we have to engage in. And I think this is why for myself, I feel like a lot of my time over the last 15 to 20 years has been focused on strategy, tactics, execution, like the how. And for the last 2 years, I've been focusing on a research piece around the purpose of capital and really trying to understand more about how historically, over literally generations, we've understood the meaning and purpose of wealth in different ways, in different cultures, in different times, and from different perspectives. And I think that we need to reconnect with some of those ideas and pull those forward, because much of our conversations today are really largely ahistorical. We're not building on what we know. And we've cut ourselves off from a host of kind of riches in terms of community knowledge and wealth. And by focusing on technology and economics to the exclusion of humanities and broader understandings of what it means to be in the world, we're doing ourselves a huge disservice, and we're cutting ourselves off from, I think, the source of our future wisdom by not bringing that previous wisdom forward. How's
Beautiful.
that?
And, so you can see why so many
See why
people
I'm so overly promoted on an
admire
artificial
Jed.
basis.
And can't wait to see the fruits of that work. Really, I mean it really genuinely. There's just not a lot of people who are willing to take on the big philosophical questions, and it's really
Some of us are
important.
no longer accepted in other places.
Some people do.
But no, thank
And
you
I
very
always
much.
savor my time with you. I know everybody did. So
Thank you.
Jed, can I just ask you one closing question? So we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, as you know, and you were there in the beginning, and I wonder what advice do you give us to sort of foster a successful next 20 years?
Just a quick closing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Read his
I
next
just
book.
dealt with the future of technology.
So you're warmed up, so let's go.
So I guess I would say don't get trapped in your own boxes. I think that you start with the big vision, and then you go to execution and strategy and again tactics. And I think that it's really easy as you're executing here to just kind of lose connection with the broader kind of wow and meaning and power of the big idea, if you will. And I think it's really easy to get trapped within your immediate kind of solution to something that actually you need to be thinking still differently about going forward. So, I mean, going back to the question around how do you engage asset owners who want a financial return and you can't give that, I think the frame is not that question, it's this question. So how do you reposition yourself with regard to some of the challenges that you have in execution? And by reframing those challenges, you can not only kind of see new opportunities and solutions that you might not have seen if you just viewed it at this level, but you also give other people an opportunity to go with you in a different way and a place. And I think that a lot of what I see in this space today is you have all these folks, everybody is supposed to be an expert and have the answer to everything kind of thing. So if you're like an entrepreneur and you're trying to get capital, God forbid, you should say to an investor that you haven't quite figured this out yet, or you're not quite sure about this, because you're supposed to be like this great entrepreneurial, passionate kind of visionary, blah, blah, blah. Or if you're a wealth advisor and you're advising a family that's got X hundreds of millions of dollars, God forbid, you should say, well, actually, I'm not so sure about this piece, right? You always have to have the answer and the response. Or if you're a thought leader, you're always supposed to be deeply insightful, all this good stuff. And I think we need to just kind of lighten up and have more, Walter Kaufman talks about ambition. And the idea that you can be hugely ambitious and you have to have humility as you pursue those ambitions, or else you begin, in my frame, you start to believe your own press releases and stuff, and you start thinking, right? And you're going, yeah, that's right, that's what we're doing, saving the poor from poverty. And it's kind of like, well, maybe not. Maybe you're doing that a little bit, but there's ways you can dial it up. And so I think just having, on the one hand, real grounding in that vision and the ambition of change, and on the other hand, a real sense of humility that, poverty will probably always be with us. That one of the reasons it will be with us is because the way humanity creates these phenomenal biases and blind spots and all kinds of stuff. And we've created so much phenomenal activity and action in the world, and we continue to do things that are just fucking mindless, right? And it's kind of like, wow, it's that both and kind of thing. And that's the reality we operate in. So I think as you think about the future, to have the ambition to approach it with a sense of kind of maybe we don't have the answer, and with, I think, a real confidence in the notion that it is through the process that the answers are revealed. So be comfortable with being in the process as opposed to selling the solution. There you go. One more.
All right, there we go.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.
I know that was waiting.